Welcome, welcome. Good to see so many of you coming to watch live. Although my colleague Crystal is going to be recording the session, we tend to get probably around about 40% live shows for most of our sessions this week. Lots of people then relying on the recordings. So if everyone can keep themselves on mute, that'd be fantastic, unless you want to then contribute to any of the discussion, in which case you're more than welcome to unmute yourself. Have your cameras on if you want. It's always great to be able to see people. I can see Chris. Hi, Chris, and Ashley. Hi, Ashley. Thanks for having your cameras on. But equally, you don't have to if you don't want to. Hi, Inna. Good to see you. If any of you got any issues with your names being on the recording, then you can rename yourself with just your first name. But equally, you know, this is just going to be sent out to people who've attended. We've got, I think, about 90 registered for this session, so they'll be receiving the video. But welcome to this session. Very interested, actually, myself, to hear the kind of discussion over the next sort of 55 minutes or so. And we've got some real kind of variety of different experts that are going to help us talk a little bit about what I'm sure we're all conscious of, which is the massive changes that have been going on in accountancy, in bookkeeping, and across the wider economy, the impact of automation, of artificial intelligence. You know, there's a bit of scaremongering that we're all going to lose our jobs to the robots, where, you know, perhaps actually it's just going to change the nature of our jobs, but we'll hopefully get into that in a little bit of detail. So we're going to kind of run this session as almost a game of two halves, as I might say. So to start with, I'm going to be talking to Andy Turpin, quite specifically about the impact of automation, cloud-based technologies, AI on accountancy practice. I think a lot of the people who are attending our festival this week are working in practice. So I'm going to be talking to Andy Turpin for the first half an hour or so, and then we've got a couple of other expert guest speakers to join us around about one. We've got Stephen Drew from the AAT and Graham Hambley from PQ Magazine, so both with a very broad sense of what's going on in the accountancy industry. So we'll be hearing from them around about 1 o'clock when we open up to a broader panel discussion. My name is Gareth. I'm one of the tutors, founders, directors of First Intuition. And I would say to anybody, you know, if you want to interact, if you've got any comments, any questions, do use the chat box. It's great to see good comments coming through the chat box. I have got one of our colleagues from First Intuition, Crystal Green. She's with us as well to help deal with the chat box. So, you know, hopefully she'll bring some of the questions from the chat box into the broader discussion, or try to answer questions that are coming up. So off we go then. Let's get stuck into the session through until about 1:30. So I'm going to start with a kind of conversation with Andy Turpin. So in fact, Andy, do you want to give a little introduction to yourself, a little bio?
Sure, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Turpin. I'm Director of the Virtual Finance Office at PEM. A little bit more about what the VFO does later, but in terms of my own career path, I graduated at De Montfort University in a sort of a part accountancy degree, and I went straight into small practice. I qualified ACCA in this small practice. It's a one partner firm with about 12 people. So I saw a little bit of everything from manual processing on desktop Sage systems to creation of small company accounts, a bit of audit, very little tax. So it's pure accounting that I did there. I then left after about 5 years, I suppose, in practice, and I've worked in industry for 9 years as a financial controller in 2 different companies locally, both of whom in sort of manufacturing, and the last one specifically engineering as well. So I kind of saw how an accounts department worked from the inside. And my role there was you know, producing the management accounts. I presented accounts to the board. I oversaw a finance team of 4 of us by the end. And I kind of got to a position where it wasn't giving me what I wanted. I was looking at different roles, and most roles I was looking at were starting to put other things into the job responsibilities, such as IT, HR, that I didn't really want to do. So I wanted a sort of a pure accounting role, and I kind of I suppose fell into this role at PM. Very kindly had an introduction to one of the partners here, and I got the job at as director of the Virtual Finance Office about 4.5 years ago. And what I wanted to do was to do accountancy, to be able to sell the services we provide and be able to work with and I suppose mentor younger members of the team throughout their sort of career progression, and that gives me a really good mix. And so for the last 4.5 years, we've grown the Virtual Finance Office more than double in size in terms of the personnel, in terms of the fee income for the practice as well. And we provide, so traditionally we provided outsourced accounting services on a multitude of platforms. So when I arrived, probably about 60–70% of the clients we worked on were on Xero and other cloud systems, and now we're probably up to about 95%. So there's a lot of transitioning onto cloud systems, and with the increase of that comes with the apps that are out there, and in terms of using those to streamline the processes.
Sorry, Andy, can I just butt in actually? You know, not let you sort of cover too much ground in one go. I mean, just going back to your career path, because I thought it was quite interesting the fact that I train a lot of students in practice who then either stay in practice or move into industry.
Yep.
Relatively uncommon in my experience to have people who move out of practice into industry and then back into practice again. And actually, has that experience you had in industry, has that been beneficial to what you currently do, would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I think because what we do now, we work with companies who don't have an accounts team, or we work with companies who just have a CFO. So having actually seen the inner workings of an accounts function has been really, really useful. So you understand the pain points that businesses go through. I don't think I could have come back into practice in a pure audit role or God forbid tax role, which I would never have done, so I never had that exposure. I think this is probably the absolute the right type of thing for somebody who's worked in industry, and many of my team have worked in industry in the past as well.
Yeah, and I mean, just from a training perspective, something I've noticed in the last sort of year to 2 years, because when I work with practice employers, typically it would be AAT, ACCA, ICAEW would tend to be the more hardcore sort of practice qualifications. But I've started to see a little bit of CIMA sneaking in, particularly into some of these sort of new departments, which I've certainly found surprising. But I guess it's those skills that are more around maybe management accounting than hardcore financial accounting. But I've certainly seen a couple of these VFOs, these virtual finance offices, kind of emerge in the last few years, and you were starting to talk a bit about that. But how would you say that a VFO function differs from perhaps those more traditional audit, tax kind of departments within a firm like PM?
So we liaise with the more traditional departments, the audit department, the tax department of PM. So our clients are clients of theirs as well. But we deal with the day-to-day accounting, the bookkeeping, interbank reconciliations, payments, sales invoices, credit control, VAT returns, management accounts, and then work with the year-end team and liaise with the tax experts. So there's a particular VAT query or employment tax query, we've got the experts within PM that can help, because most of my team are trainees, so be it AAT or ACCA or CIMA. Most of the team are training. I think there are 5 of us who are qualified. I think I'm right in saying all ACCA qualified, but the majority are trainees, and most of whom have trained with you, Gareth, as you know. So it's a real mixture of qualifications, but it's about providing the day-to-day and month-to-month services, but also have access to the experts in PM that provide everything that a firm needs.
And so, I mean, I think back to my days in practice 25 years ago, when I was still writing things out by hand, line by line, in massive, big, proper ledgers. And obviously, since then, we've moved through spreadsheets, and now increasingly towards cloud platforms. Your Sages, your Xeros, and I guess the nature of your entire team is really leveraging those technologies. So, can you tell us a bit about, that role that technology does play in the activities of your team?
Yeah, so when I arrived sort of 4.5 years ago, we were using Xero for most clients, but not using it as well as we could. But the first thing to do after getting Xero or QuickBooks or Sage, I'll be agnostic here, is to, well, those notice my water bottle, I'm not particularly agnostic, is to get the bank feed working. So rather than having to key in bank information, the feed comes in automatically. And then the next thing is the data extraction. So I don't think there's any point using Xero and manually processing like you would have done with a Sage desktop system. It's actually utilizing the data extraction tools, be it Receipt Bank, HubDoc, Auto Entry, Data Molino. There's several out there that can do that. So making sure that you use the technology as an enabler. And once you've got the good data, that then really frees up you to use other cloud tools in the digital sphere to be able to use that data to do things with it, be it cash flow forecast or using it for credit control. But it's having that core data first of all. And I think if anybody is working with a cloud product and doesn't have the data extraction tools utilized properly, then you're not really harnessing the power.
Sure. Now, actually, you sort of mentioned during that bit around, being agnostic, and actually, from your perspective, running a team within a firm, is it easier if you just have all your clients on one platform, like Xero, say, or is it fine if you've got clients who are using various different software platforms?
It's easier for the team if you're just using one platform, and I think it's ultimately easier and better for the client if you're using one platform. Providing it's the right platform, and we do have some clients who don't use Xero, but it's easier to train the team on just one platform. Anything we use internally, so we use Receipt Bank for data extraction internally, and I think if the client's not necessarily seeing it doesn't matter. We've got to make sure we use one particular platform. If we're doing credit control work, we use one platform, and we're just looking at softwares to be able to better automate payments for clients. So we're not setting up each individual payment separately on a bank software. You can just make one payment and the rest sort of happens automatically behind the scenes. And we're evaluating the softwares out there and we'll decide on the one we feel is the best for what we need it for. So yeah, I would say definitely advise, yes, use one, but do your due diligence and have a look around and see what's there. And if something else improves and out there that's better, then be prepared to switch, because that's going to happen with technology and the speed of pace it moves.
Well, I mean, that in itself, is a question I might put to you. Actually, how on earth? Because as an outsider, I mean, I'm not working in practice, but we use a cloud platform, and we use things like Receipt Bank, Go Cardless, Futurely for dashboarding. So we're trying to make use of some of the. Now, I always hear the term ecosystem, this ecosystem of apps, 700, 800, I don't know how many, probably 10 more every week virtually. I mean, how on earth do you and your team can possibly keep up with that number of apps and the generation of new apps?
Yeah, the answer is you don't keep up with everything. You look at what you need internally and you look at what your clients need specifically, and then you go out there and decide on the best one to use, and then you learn it, and then you share the learnings internally. We've got 22 people in the team, and probably only Xero and Receipt Bank everybody knows intimately, and the other ones we have little groups where certain groups of people will be sort of up to speed with cash flow apps, certain groups of people will be up to speed with virtual credit control apps and be evaluating those and then sharing them with their colleagues. So you can't, you have to pick your, use the term app stack, probably heard that before as well, Gareth. You have to pick your app stack and then and run with it. And we probably have about 8 to 10 that we use, and somebody within the team will have experience and exposure to those 8 to 10, but no one will have exposure and experience to all of them.
No, that sounds like an interesting way to do it, actually. Have almost pockets of expertise and familiarity. And would the staff themselves have responsibility perhaps for looking at, because presumably new apps crop up fairly regularly, is that something that individual members of the team would be looking out for? Is that more your sort of job?
Yes, the individuals would look out for them. I may get an email or speak to somebody about a particular app and they say it's really cool, and so I might have a little look myself and then and ping it out to a colleague and say, have a look at this, tell me what you think. So it's a bit of a mixture really, but everybody has their own their day job, so to speak, in terms of looking after clients. So it's quite hard to then have the app responsibility as well, which is why we decided to sort of separate it and have a mixture of people. Some firms have gone down different routes and had a cloud champion involved. I've got some colleagues elsewhere, and people I know elsewhere in the country who have gone down that route themselves, and it's whatever's right for you as an individual and a firm. Sometimes I think that the pace of change may be quicker if somebody has that sole role as cloud champion, but then you've got all your eggs in one basket, and it can be a little bit difficult if that person's not available.
Yeah, or I guess if they move on from
Correct,
the firm they work with, that's quite a high exposure.
Yeah.
And I get the impression that particularly the firms, and I'm guessing this last 5 months will really have crystallised the difference between the more cloud-based digital firms and those that are a bit more old-fashioned and have more manual records, which perhaps will have caused more complications during lockdown. But I get the impression that the cloud accounting community is actually very kind of close and supportive. I mean, I know you're part of the digital
accountancy show, yeah, and definitely. And we're part of Creston as well in PEM. So I've got colleagues elsewhere in the country who are part of Creston and do similar roles to me in their practices. So we caught up. I've caught up with various people a few times over the last few months as to how everyone's handling things, and we're all doing things in the same way. We're all working from home. We're all sort of leveraging the technology. We all have most of our clients who are well behaved and don't keep bags of paper and deliver it once a quarter the day before that return date. Most are using the data extraction tools, and it has enabled us to provide that continuity over the last 4 or 5 months for clients who haven't necessarily struggled themselves, because there's some clients who are in particular industries where lockdown hasn't presented an issue, and they still need to be sort of business as usual, processing invoices, having management accounts, making payments, and having the system set up in this way has really enabled that to happen. So I think it's I guess credit to the technology that it's out there, and how clients and we use it to make it sure it's as seamless and provide the continuity in the difficult climate we're in.
And I mean, can I assume that actually lockdown has had limited effect on your team and its operations by its nature?
There's these sort of challenges in terms of communication. So we had to put MS Teams in pretty quickly just before lockdown to make sure that we're all communicating, but that's worked really, really well. So we had to start with daily catch-ups. We have 3 distinct pods within the team, so each pod had a daily catch-up to start with, and we've relaxed it slightly to 3 times a week now, so people are keeping up to speed that way. Now, as you can see, I'm back in the office today, so we're all back in 2 days a week. Everyone's in, but one day no one's in at all, but everyone's in 4 days. Someone's in 4 days a week, and that's working with some people being off at home and some people being here, so still communicating. But the actual client service hasn't been an issue. I guess it's the internal communication, it's the support for younger colleagues, less experienced colleagues, that we have to make sure that we are maintaining. So it's not a case of you just put your hand up or tap the person on the shoulder that's near you and say, I've got a question, can I help? It's just making sure that you're touching base with the right people at the right time to make sure they're okay.
Sure. So actually, if you're in the office, you're probably about half a mile from me, actually, just that way over the river, because I'm just around the corner from Milton. So
yeah, indeed, yeah.
So I mean, just backtracking a little bit, actually, I'm just interested. I mean, having the VFO, set up within PM, has that changed the kind of revenue streams that the firm has been able to generate?
I wouldn't say it's changed it. I mean, the VFO revenue stream itself has increased. It's more than doubled over the last 4.5 years. So it's an additional revenue stream rather than a change necessarily. I think within VFO, we've done a lot more. Would you call it advisory? I suppose over the last 12-18 months. I mean, MTD started the process, but then they allowed bridging software, which kind of I suppose, stop the process a little bit. So a lot of clients we had moving across from desktop systems to cloud systems to file their VAT returns automatically through NTD compliant software. I think that COVID's probably helped speed up the digitalisation as well, with people finding that working from home is very, very difficult if they don't have the right systems. So we're seeing a few conversions over the last 2 or 3 months as well, as clients have switched system. And I think it's people are kind of getting wise to there's more products out there within the cloud ecosystem, as the word you used earlier, Gareth. So it's not just about processing in the cloud, it's about data extraction, it's about authorization workflows, it's about cash flow, it's about credit control, it's about payment processes. There's a lot of different things, and businesses are not just utilizing the cloud software, but it's 4 or 5 different softwares in the ecosystem that suits them as a business.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned, I think probably most of us are aware of Receipt Bank, and it's quite a common app to be using. Can you give us any sort of specific, interesting examples of any other kind of apps or applications that we might find useful?
So we've used one called Approval Max for a few clients now, which rather than having invoice come in, printed out, put in tray, and then sent around the building for sign off, it's a sort of electronic version of that. So invoice comes into Receipt Bank, data extracted, appears in Xero, and then it kickstarts the approval, depending on who the supplier is or what the value is, so the right people can approve it. So that's become quite popular over the last 4 or 5 months in particular. We partner up with one called Chaser in terms of credit control, and we're doing virtual credit control for a few clients now, and some clients have been using it themselves as well. So that's another one that we've been utilizing a bit more. And we're looking at things like Fluidly or Futurely, as you mentioned before, Gareth, for cash flow. At the start of lockdown, we provided all clients with a free 3-month cash flow forecast. We actually used Float for it, which is another cash flow app. I think worth looking at that as well. And we're thinking in terms of now that businesses are starting to think about what a return to normal might look like. Looking further ahead, probably a 12-month cash flow is probably more relevant now than a 3-month, because the government's unravelling process is going to happening now. Anyone who's deferred VAT has got to pay it by the 31st of March. Furloughing is coming to an end in October. So these are the sort of things that people need to be thinking about. So I'd say it's the making sure that the availability of cash and its understanding when the cash is going to be coming are probably the key parts at the moment.
Yeah, like you say, I think 12 months cash flow is more necessary, but also far harder, I think, at the moment to pin down, because the level. I was this morning on a Bank of England call actually, and the Bank of England confess they've no real certainty of where things are going to be in the next few months, let alone the next year or so. But yeah, no, I quite agree. I think 5 years progress in 5 months. Do you think this has really forced the pace of digitization and communication technologies? You talked about being back in the office maybe a couple of days a week.
Yep.
Is that something, do you think, that will stay with us? Do you think you'll ever go back to 5 days a week, 9 to 5 in the office?
No, I don't think so. I think that there'll be some sort of hybrid between working from home full time and working in the office full time. I think it has to be a business need, a business case to be in the office or be at home. I think making sure that trainees get inducted and trained properly is a good reason to probably be in the office. But then when there are certain people who can work a bit more independently and can work from home, I think that you don't want to lose the office banter entirely. You don't want to go 100% work from home, I don't think, in my own personal view. And I think sort of probably a 2 to 3 days a week in the office and 2 to 3 days at home is probably going to become the norm. But there'll be people who want to be in the office more. So I guess it's a case of making sure that's flexible as well.
Yeah, no, quite interesting. You're talking about the high proportion of trainees on your team. I mean, is that a factor of the growth of the team, or just the nature of the work? And also, what does that change the skills you think you require in your team versus perhaps other more conventional departments?
Yeah, lots of questions there. I think yes, it does highlight the growth. I think that getting people in and trained at a young age it's a familiar path to me, and so I understand. I think it's right. And we get people coming in; they're very keen to learn the technology as well as learning the accounting skills and getting the marrying up of the two. I know you and I have talked about that in the past, and getting both the core accounting and the technology skills in place, and how that works. I think that it does represent the growth. We have brought people in from elsewhere in the practice into VFO, and we have appointed people at a higher level who have perhaps trained elsewhere. But I think the core is really bring people in at a training level and then bring them through, teach them how we do things, teach them the core accounting skills, teach them about the technology, and then they'll go and provide a great service to clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think technology has the power potentially to. I mean, I remember when I started in practice, they didn't let me talk to clients until I was a third year. I was sitting, ticking, bashing bank statements for pretty much the first 2 years. Whereas I'm hearing stories now that, almost 6 weeks out of school, youngsters in, practices are now talking to clients, advising on use of Xero. So actually requiring broader skills from them at a much, much earlier age.
Yeah. And I remember my first starting out in practice, I was like T-boy to start with, and he wasn't trusted with an email address until I was assistant manager. That sort of stuff, it's sort of really alien to how things are now. But no, you're right. I mean, straight away when the trainees come in, we've got an induction program for the first 4 weeks or so, where they learn everything they need to, do a bit of shadowing with the people here. But then they'll be let loose with clients in terms of processing and chasing up clients for missing information and growing from there. So it is very early on. They'll be liaising directly with clients.
Fantastic. Well, that's actually, I think, quite a good place, because we do have another couple of expert speakers to kind of broaden this discussion out. So I'm hoping you'll sort of stay with us, Andy, and contribute over the next half an hour. And for any of you, watching this, if you've got any questions that you think Andy might be able to help you with, feel free to drop them into the chat box. But I'd now like to introduce, really delighted to also have Stephen Drew and Graham Hambley. So to start with, maybe just the two of you just introduce yourselves briefly.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. That's what I used to look like. So before lockdown, I looked a little bit like that. Unfortunately, as an asthmatic, I've been trying to just stay out of the way. So apart from riding my bike, I haven't actually visited any shops in the last 6 months. So hence the reason I'm perhaps looking as if I've been dragged through a hedge backwards. So yeah, I just thought it was perhaps quite important to show you what I used to look like before lockdown. You
want to get? I've bought myself a pair of clippers.
Yeah, it's interesting. When yourself, Graham, and Andy sort of came on the call, I was thinking, right, you guys have worked out the practicalities of hairdressing a little bit better than perhaps I have. Maybe this is to my advantage at some stage, but certainly at the moment, not quite so much. But yeah, back in the real world, I'm Stephen Drew. I'm AAT's head of market and products. So I work within the AAT's marketing division, and broadly speaking, my team are accountable for, in many respects, a lot of, if not all, a lot of what AAT actually does. So we're involved in student activity with you guys. We're involved in engaging our members and developing value propositions for our professional members. We're also involved in insight and research, and I will share a few thoughts around that, just some findings that we've had recently that you might find interesting. And we're also involved in new product development as well. So I will also share a few thoughts on some of the things that we are thinking about and how AAT can add value, I guess, to all of you as AAT students. But I think beyond that, as a post-qualification sort of relationship, what we're looking to do, in this digital space, but I think to try and help members come to terms with the fact that, the world is changing. And as Andy has already said, the profession is changing greatly. So, it's really exciting times, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. One of the reasons I thought you'd be really useful in this discussion is, we've had endless conversations in the last 2 or 3 years around, and Andy's talked there about data extraction, data analytics, and it's kind of thing we've talked about, and the impact of AI. Where is this profession of ours actually heading, and therefore where do the awarding bodies need to head? So it'd be great to hear from that. And Graham.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Graham Hambley. I am, for my sins, I'm the editor of PQ magazine. I was looking back, actually, apart from working on Past magazine as well, I was editor of Accounting Technician many, many hundreds of years ago.
Okay.
When the
Well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, when the CEO was Tony Sainsbury, and he used to send me my commentary back with little red lines underneath it saying how this wasn't quite the policy. But he, you know, he was a great guy, and that was my first encounter with the AAT all those years ago. I'm a member of the HMRC Agent Strategy Working Group as well, the only sort of non-member body. I don't know, I've told them hundreds of times I'm a journalist, but they don't seem to understand. But that's great. It means I get to go to HMRC and discuss the things that have direct effect on people working in practice. And my final sort of string to my bow, I'm also on the curriculum advisory board of one of the universities, London South Bank University, who's one of the top universities in London with their accountancy degrees, who are doing work with the AAT as well to look at expanding how they have a proper relationship with some of the other accountancy bodies. So that's really my background, and I've been writing about accountancy for 30 years. I'm not an accountant. I have never taken an accountancy exam, but I have worked in an accounts department for Guy's University when I was just left school. Unfortunately, looking back at it, sometimes I wish I'd stayed there and got qualified. But I can't say I really miss not being an accountant. Being a journalist is not too bad either.
Brilliant, and thanks, Graham. And I thought, again, everybody, everybody knows you. You've got your finger in an awful lot of different sort of pies. You arrange, I know you've arranged conferences in the last year or two around things like the future of the profession, the future of accountancy. So again, very interested to sort of hear your perspective. But I'm kind of going to hand over to Stephen now, actually, because I think you're going to sort of chair our little discussion, aren't you?
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Andy. Sorry, I can see you're on mute. Could I ask you a question of you, please?
Sure.
I mean, you talked a little bit about onboarding new staff, and you talked a little bit around the new normal and how you probably won't be in the office as much as you were. I guess from my perspective, I've talked to quite a lot of AAT members, and we're getting mixed reports of what people are doing. So at one end of the spectrum, you've got people who are still wedded to the traditional way, and they're looking as early as possible to get back into the office full time. And at the other end of the spectrum, at a recent AAT member conference, I talked to a member who was very keen for her practice to almost go 100% remote. So the likelihood was that, they would be recruiting, with geography not really being a factor within it. But I noticed from the chat box, there are a couple of people who've, asked questions about the fact, or made points about how, perhaps it's a little bit easier for more mature staff to work from home. And certainly for younger managers or for younger staff, there could be problems, just really engaging with their colleagues. I just wondered if you'd had any thoughts on how you might be engaging new staff or younger staff, and how you can maybe maintain that banter that you talked about you might get when you're in the office.
Yeah, so we've got 2 trainees joining us on Friday. I'm not going to see them until Monday the 24th. We've got other commitments, and we've then got an induction program. It's probably going to be for the first 4 weeks, where they'll be in the office every day with a member of the team who's going to be showing them different things. So certainly for the first 4 weeks, it's going to be office every day. And I think then as they gain a bit more experience, 4 weeks isn't very long, but they'll have met all their colleagues. And I think it's easier to do video calls with people once you've actually physically met them, seen them, touched them, maybe not touched them, but you've actually got started a relationship. I think then it'll be, I'd like them in the office more often than not. But it may well be that we start saying, okay, you work from home a day, work from home a couple of days, and see how people get on and cope. I think it's that very first 2 weeks, 4 weeks of getting them in the office every day, being with their colleagues, knowing who does what, knowing how things work, so they can really kind of get under the bonnet and really understand what's going on here.
Super. No, it's really interesting. I mean, it will be interesting to see, how it materialises. I mean, for AAT, they're talking to employers a lot at the moment, because September time usually peak period for recruitment, people starting qualifications, as Gareth will be aware, as a lot of you guys will be aware, and that there are certainly mixed views on how that's going to work. You know, we spoke to Grant Thornton recently, for example, who I think you know, are looking to almost do this entirely remotely. You know, I spoke to someone at Boots recently who said exactly the same. But you know, especially once maybe you get outside of the bigger conurbations, you know, people focusing very much on what you're talking about there, about you know the need to actually meet and you know, if not shake hands anymore, then at least you know be able to wave gently, you know, at 2 meters distance.
It's something that we saw, you know, right at the start of the lockdown. A lot of trainees were furloughed. You know, they could carry on studying, so actually some of them were doing more studying than normal because they didn't have, you know, traveling, they didn't have work. But often the reason for furloughing the trainees wasn't actually the lack of work. It was the practicalities and the logistics of managing, you know, delegating to and monitoring relatively inexperienced staff. And in some respects, it was easy to almost just get them out of sight, out of mind, let the more experienced staff crack on with the work. Because I know a lot of firms have been phenomenally busy. But obviously as the furlough scheme now unwinds and as new intakes arrive in the workplace, you know, there's a lot of work to do around that, you know, onboarding. You know, we're hearing, you know, what Andy said. I think it's quite common that firms are prioritizing junior staff to be in the workplace, you know, with immediate mentors. I think we'll see quite a lot of that.
Yeah, just on the furloughing point, Gareth, we, as a firm, a lot of the trainees here were furloughed, including the two that sit within in VFO. So both have been with us about 12 months now, and they're both furloughed for 3 to 4 weeks, something like that. And we used that time to kind of really address what they were doing, who was doing what, to then, when we brought them back, they weren't so reliant on people hand feeding them work. They actually had their own client responsibilities, albeit certain work for certain clients, and then we use that as an opportunity to really look at that. And I think that really helped.
Yeah, no, good stuff. Thank you, Graham. One for you here. Good afternoon. Andy's obviously talked at length there, you know, around how COVID-19 and how technology is shaping the smaller practice. Obviously, in your role, you know, with a slightly wider view of the profession, the people that you speak to, have you got any observations on, I guess, how big a business, how industry and commerce, or perhaps the public sector, you know, might be evolving, you know, their role and the role of finance within it, you know, obviously, you know, with more people, with perhaps bigger budgets involved. Any thoughts on that?
I think the pandemic has been a really interesting, almost experiment on how you can digitalize the business very quickly, how you can change your processes. And it's been amazing how quickly people have done that. There are huge issues about working from home. There'll be a lot of mental health issues. We've run a couple of stories now about people not quite, you know, I on a personal level, I've moved home from my business. I don't have an office anymore. We used to have an office. I didn't visit it for 3 months, so I didn't need to. But then you've got someone like Royal Bank of Scotland who said it doesn't expect to see any of its staff back in the office until 2021. Mm-hmm. Now, PwC, they have 22,000 people working for them in this country. They've had about 5,000 of those people back in the office. By the end of September, the CEO there wants about 11,000 to have come back. But they said, you know, presentationism, you know, coming to work, being seen at work, being there at 9, going home at 5. He said he thinks that's dead. He thinks we might have finally burst the bubble about just because you're sitting at your desk doesn't mean you're actually being productive, you know, and engaging with clients and doing the right thing. So I think the world is going to change. And I think, I mean, the idea of coming all the way into town, you know, spending an hour and a half on the tube with a mask on, you know, sort of, I've just been writing stories about students having to wear masks in exam halls for 3 hours. I mean, I've taken, I'm sure everyone, I don't know if you've all taken a trip on public transport recently. After about 40 minutes in this heat, obviously not you, but about 40 minutes, you know, it becomes pretty unbearable. So 3 hours, 4 hours sitting in exams not going to be great. If that's something you're supposed to do, you don't have to necessarily. And I just think people are just looking at work differently, hopefully. And I do think there's an issue about, you know, the maturity of the person at home and the work that they've got to do. And, you know, sort of eventually we will have to look at that. But I think people will change. I think the ideas of If you look at PwC's offices now, people don't have their desks. They hot desk. So the idea was coming. I just think this has all accelerated it.
Yeah.
And I think it's a bit like the exams. The remote exams were coming. The ACCA and AAT, we were looking at them. It's been problematic to do it when you can't actually meet anyone and talk to people and actually make that work. But I think we're gone ahead of the curve now.
Yeah, nice one.
I'll stop there.
Gareth, no problem. No, interesting. So, Gareth, just changing the subject slightly. I mean, again, picking up on a few things that you and Andy talked about earlier. It strikes me, a number of different things, but the role of the accountant is most definitely changing here. And I think a lot of that is being accelerated by technology. The amount of data that's now at your disposal, the amount of real-time information that you've got. But I think Andy also made another really interesting point, and I think you've made this to me previously as well, about how, you're probably expected to be in more of a client-facing or customer-facing role much earlier in your career now. So not only is it just about the qualification, but it feels like it's also around, the student, the guys listening here, developing, a range of skills and behaviors, which will make the difference between the people who just do a job and those people perhaps who are most successful. How might you advise people listening about that? I know you've talked quite passionately about the value of skills and behaviors before. What would your advice be to them for that?
Yeah, and actually, going back to the point I made sort of earlier on in the talk when I was talking to Andy about, the fear that robots are going to take your jobs and artificial intelligence is going to do everything that we do and none of us will have work. Actually, I think it's just going to change the nature of the work that lots of people, but particularly that accountants do. I think historically accountancy, it was always quite input driven. It was, the clerk sitting there, like me years ago, writing things into ledgers, or now typing things into ledgers. It was very input driven, which, let's be honest, is not the most rewarding, exciting work in the whole wide world. Accountancy is much more output driven now. So many of the, Andy was talking about some of the apps and the cloud platforms that kind of do all of that stuff automatically. We don't need to type in receipts anymore because we use Receipt Bank and actually automatically posts invoices. We don't need to do a bank reconciliation anymore because Xero automatically reconciles the bank through our bank feed. So actually it makes the accountant's job, I think, much more sort of sexy, much more interesting. It's much more about taking the output of the system, analyzing it. It's much more of those analytical abilities, the decision making, communication, absolutely, moving into, so I think the impact of automation is it takes away a lot of the drudgery that actually gives accountancy a bit of a bad name and actually frees us up to do much more interesting, much more impactful work, to advise boards on what they're actually, what do the numbers mean? It's almost telling stories with the numbers, which feeds in, and I'm sure you can guess where I'm going with this, Stephen, around the apprenticeships, and the apprenticeships that become such a big deal in accountancy since the new standards came in, since the levy came in, because the apprenticeships do embed not just the technical knowledge, not just how to do a bank rec and how to do a tax comp, but it's all these skills and behaviors, things like teamworking and communication and negotiation skills, leadership, the things I think, far, far more important to the distance your career goes. You don't get to a lofty position in your career because you can do the number crunching. That's a given. I spent a lot of last year working with, Mark Farrar, you're the chief executive of the AAT, he came to visit some employers and, we talked at length about the skills that accountants need and nobody ever mentions accountancy. It's these other skills that are much more powerful, much more critical, I think, now.
Yeah, sure. We just to reassure everyone, I mean, the point you make about are the robots going to take over? This was actually a question that was posed of us, I think probably going back at least 2 years, probably even before that. But I distinctly remember one conversation about 2 years ago, which resulted in a big research piece that I did with Nottingham Business School. And there was a point there, the question was posed, is the AAT qualification and are AAT members obsolete because of technology? And, that's an interesting one. That sounds like a bit of a challenge. That sounds like that could be a bit of a business risk. But I think the good news for us, and to reassure you all listening, The research, well, 100% well and truly said that actually, rather than this being, you know, a risk to AAT and our membership, our students, actually this was a real opportunity. Because, you know, the AAT qualification with the content that you learn around bookkeeping and around costing, around tax, but, you know, very practical skills. Actually, when you understand that, it gives the AAT member, it gives the AAT student, you know, a real opportunity to make sure that, you know, they understand why the technology is telling them one thing and to explain that well. And I think that for us really recognised, or helped us recognise that actually, rather than it being a threat, technology was a real opportunity for AAT, and you know, really did add value to the qualification.
And I think, you know, I'm sure you'll have heard, because we were supposed to be joined today by Mike Day, one of the directors at Xero, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. But I've heard him many times talking about, he used the expression that even if the software's doing all the number crunching, you've still got to know what's going on under the bonnet. So, you know, he, you know, as a director of one of the big cloud accounting platforms, he still thinks that those fundamental skills are critical. And the employers I talk to, you know, they still say, you know, people still need to understand debits and credits and suspense accounts and journals, because if anything goes wrong in your accounting system, how are you going to unpick it and correct problems if you don't fundamentally understand what's going on?
Graham, if tech is driving the agenda, why do we still need qualifications?
Sorry, pressed the wrong button there. So you can hear me. Oh, I think the issue is, for me, it's always because we're people, and people are important. You know, you can have great cloud stuff, the apps are important, but you know, people need to still speak to people, and you need to be able to communicate. Only I could do that, and engage with people. And that is still a core area. It's always been, you know, everyone used to call them the soft skills. In fact, they're not the soft skills. They're the most important skills. Let the computer, let the devices talk to each other. They will do that, and you'll get the end result. But if you don't understand the end result, then there's no point in worrying about it. But professional qualifications and how they fit it measures people's ability to understand. If you look at most CEO roles, you'll see that 20–30% of CEOs in this country come from a CFO background, probably a bit higher than that. And there's a reason for that. Understanding the financial, real digging down into what a company does and understanding the numbers and the figures and being able to crunch those down is really, really key in pushing businesses forward and understanding where the costs are, where the threats are, where the risks are. You know, compliance is now the way that we live in a world now. I'm writing stories every day about computer hackers taking down systems, taking down universities, and you need people to understand where the investment needs to go in a company, and accountants can do that, and that's what the professional qualification gives you.
Brilliant, thank you. Andy, if you were going to advise the guys listening in today, if they were to make a positive contribution starting work for a business like yours, you know, what advice would you give in terms of, you know, making a positive contribution and getting stuck into all this technology?
I think there's we sort of talked about it before, really. I think the three things, it's the core accounting skills that everybody needs to have to understand what's going on under the bonnet, because Xero, you can do things like a spend money or a pay money transaction, and it just works nicely. But understanding what happens beneath the surface is so important, and I think that making sure that people understand that. I think it's embracing the technology and thinking, do I have to do that myself, or can I use the technology to do that for me? Things like the data extraction is just the start, and I think you touched on it a moment ago. There are ways that systems can transfer invoices between each other. So Xero has something called a network key, whereas you've got two clients on Xero that one's selling to the other, you can connect it via the network key, and there's no data extraction required. And that will come for all systems to do that. That's something that will happen in the next, I want to say years, but it might be months, I don't know. So making sure you understand the technology, but using the technology not because it's there, but actually for understanding what you're using it for. So think about the problems and be curious, be inquisitive, ask questions. So the soft skills that Graham referred to, and I totally agree with what you're saying. These are all important. The human side. I mean, Zero made a big plug at the conference. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, about the human side, which Mike would have talked about if he was here. And the boring bits of accounting are being replaced by machines, which means then that people can do more of what they're doing overseeing that bit, or they can start doing other things and being interested. And I think it's just thinking about the work you're doing, the clients you're working on, and what more you could do for them, and be inquisitive, ask questions, because a lot of the trainees, the young people, they want to learn. They're keen. All of them want to learn. They're keen. They're like sponges. They soak up information, and they're really asking the right questions that people that are just doing it day to day don't really think about. So I think you said be inquisitive, learn the basics, and just be keen to understand the technology.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Graham. Another one for you. Andy mentioned the Zero conference. I can't remember if it was at the Zero conference or the QuickBooks conference last year. I remember listening to someone talk about digital accountancy, and there was a view that perhaps at best there were only a quarter of accountants who were actually using this technology to its full effect, or using it well. How do you think, for a business like AAT, or an awarding organisation, professional body like AAT or ACCA, CIMA, etc., what do you think our role is in terms of accelerating change?
For me, I think what's really interesting what's happening, particularly in the firms and areas where accounts are struggling with digitalisation. Their new recruits, the people they're recruiting, are the people that are helping to drive through change for them. For a lot of firms, if you don't, you're going to have difficulty attracting AATs, good staff. If they come into an office and all they see is files, and they see a stuffy, old view accountancy office, they would turn around, walk out, and you'll never see them again. So firms understand to get good graduates, good AATs, someone who can really help your business. You've got to show them that you're actually in this century, not in the 1700s. And I think it's firms understand this, and they've got computer literate clients coming in one way, and they've got graduates and potential new employers coming the other way, saying we want you. Where's all the computers? Where's all the stuff? Where are the apps? Whereabouts on the cloud are we? And you've got the firm in the middle, and if it hasn't changed, if it doesn't adapt, it will struggle. And I think a lot of those people will be looking to sell their practice, because because making tax digital and everything else is the future, and it's here. The future's here.
I mean, on that point, actually, Graham, I had an experience, and this is a few months ago, probably tail end of last year, where I went from one client to another, and it was chalk and cheese. So the first client was up in Norwich, Will Farnell, that some of you may have heard of. He's very, very big online for advocating for digital firms. He's one of the first 100% digital firms. So you can imagine his office was, I felt embarrassed having a piece of paper on the desk, because it was the only piece of paper anywhere. And then I went to another of my clients who had to move a big pile of files to make space for me to then put a pad down to take notes. And it was such an extreme contrast. And I said to the second client, I said, what are your thoughts on digital cloud services? And he said, oh, I'm hoping it won't make too much impact before I sell up. And I thought, well, A, it's already making a pretty big impact. And I thought, B, who's going to buy that practice? where's the succession for that practice? And I actually started to feel quite bad for him, because he's run that practice for decades. But who's going to buy that?
I think you're right. It's a good point. I mean, Andy, is there still a role for spreadsheets and graph paper? Or is it time to move on?
Graph paper, no. Spreadsheets, I'd like to say no. The trouble is that when you've got data and you want to manipulate it, then spreadsheets still are probably the best thing to do. Where I don't like spreadsheets is where people are sort of playing around with budgets and export it to a spreadsheet, because you can do that through the software, or cash flow forecast. You can do that through the software. But we use spreadsheets for things, and there are clever ways to connect spreadsheets as well. DataDeer is a cloud company that can do that sort of thing. I try and avoid them. I won't do reporting on spreadsheets. Reporting comes straight out of software.
Interesting stuff. Thank you. Can I just share my screen? Just as a, to sort of conclude, I guess, because I'm conscious of time. I did a roundtable like this with some AAT members and also a couple of the software providers quite recently. And I thought, just to conclude, a few comments from them amused me no end. Just picking up on that point there, the question to Andy about, spreadsheets and also, I guess, the point you made about desktop software earlier. There's a sort of colleague of ours who suggested that actually working with desktop software now is a bit like working with a candle. And actually, with all of that, material, all of that data that's now at your disposal, cloud is really the opportunity to go fully electric. And fully see what you're doing, gather that real-time information. It also amused me no end to see that they were referring to some of the apps in that ecosystem that you talked about. Really, they're now doing the dirty work. I think the days where a client would walk into your office and drop carry a bag full of receipts on the desk and expect you to enter that into a spreadsheet or enter that into a system. Clearly we don't need to do that. You don't need to do that anymore. So, what that really all adds up to is that, the accountant, as far as I can see, is really there now, rather than just simply to make a business compliant with the HMRC. It's really about, affecting your role to genuinely help business grow. And I think in many respects, this is one of the interesting things that we've taken away from lockdown and the fact that we're all working remotely now. The businesses that I've spoken to who are working remotely and are working digitally, have had a real opportunity to affect change, very much like, you discussed there, Andy. And then you've got the others at the other end of the spectrum where perhaps, they haven't embraced this. And clearly the role that they've been able to have in keeping business afloat or, helping business look to come out of lockdown, still exist and look to grow, I think their role is perhaps, diminished slightly. So it's been a really interesting experience and a really sort of interesting activity for us to observe. I posed the question to Gareth at the beginning around, I guess, skills and behaviours. And this is something that, I thought as a takeaway, this was perhaps useful for you guys as AAT students, because one of the things that I've been working through, shamelessly stealing some of the language that Andy and Zero and Gareth and everyone else uses. I almost filled my digital accountancy bingo card, sort of listening to Gareth and Andy earlier talking about the ecosystem and talking about the app stacks and Zero and QuickBooks, Receipt Bank, etc. But for me, I think the way I'm looking at this at the moment, the way that AAT is starting to look at this is very much about, you need that qualification at the core. And having that knowledge really then gives you the opportunity to, if you're working in practice like Andy, to engage with some of these apps and deal with some of the software, engage with some of the software providers like Zero, like QuickBooks, like Sage, etc. And then select the apps and develop that app stack, which is likely to be of use to you and to your clients. But then I think in that peripheral space around it, it's thinking about, right, how can you as the accountant, how can you as the finance function, really look to use your qualification and develop those skills so you can add genuine value. And regardless of whether you're working in the public sector or industry and commerce or practice, it seems to me that, digital accountants or business partners, as, a lot of our colleagues in bigger business are describing it, some of these skills seem to be where I think people are able to add genuine value. And for you guys as AAT students, I think one of the points I would add to that, Gareth mentioned apprentices, our statistics suggest that the people who are, working on apprenticeship programs and are developing these skills and behaviours are up to 50% more successful with their studies. So, not only is it important in the workplace, but I think the whole sort of point around storytelling and problem solving, strategic thinking, relationship management, working in teams, etc., etc. Those skills are a key part of actually being successful in your studies as well as being successful in your career. And for us as AAT, that's most definitely, a direction of travel that we're looking to move in, and certainly something where, we're looking to develop what we do so we can support more of you so you can be successful in both your qualifications, but also in your careers as well. Crystal, Gareth, I'm conscious of time. Anything else that you want to add to that? Anything else, any other questions from the floor that you want to share before we conclude?
Just one question possibly for Andy from Jessica. So for startup companies that don't operate on a day-to-day basis, so seasonal companies, what would be the best accounting software to use? Is there an alternative to using spreadsheets, which probably is what's currently used?
I would, based on my experience, I would always suggest Xero, and there are different levels of licenses. So you can buy a cheaper license based on the number of transactions, you spend less money, or go through a Xero partner who should be able to provide you with a cheaper license because of their own discounts. That's not to say that the likes of QuickBooks or Free Agent wouldn't work for you. It's just my personal experience and exposure that leads me to suggest Xero.
Lovely, thank you, Andy. I think that was probably the only question that we had. There were some great comments coming through through the chat box, which were really sort of focused on what you guys were delivering.
Fabulous, thanks, Crystal. Well, I found that fascinating. I don't know about anyone else, but that's been a great overview from some very sort of different perspectives with our speakers today. So as we wind up, just thank you very much to Andy for his thoughts. Thank you to Stephen, particularly for sort of chairing that last half an hour. And thanks a lot for Graham for joining us. Always a great perspective to hear from Graham. Thank you for attending and watching. Thanks for contributing. It has been recorded, so we will be sending the recording out to everyone who has registered. Feel free to pass that on to anyone else you think might find that discussion useful. But apart from that, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you at some of our further sessions. We're now basically officially halfway through our festival. Wednesday lunchtime. It's going swimmingly so far. So thank you, everybody. See you all soon.